A long, straight road, stretching from horizon to horizon. It cuts through forests and mountains and deserts and river valleys. It crosses bridges built so perfectly that some of them still stand today. 2,000 years later, this road goes everywhere. To the coast of Britain in the north, to the burning sands of Egypt in the south, to the rivers of Mesopotamia in the east, to the Atlantic Ocean in the west. And every road on this network leads to one place, one city, one idea, Rome. Tonight, we walk that road together, all the way back, to the greatest empire the ancient world ever produced. Before we begin tonight's journey, welcome. If you are new to this channel, we are so glad you found us. This is History Tales for Sleep, where the ancient world becomes your bedtime story. New sleep history stories arrive every Tuesday and Friday. If these stories bring you peace and carry you into rest, we would love for you to subscribe. So a new story is always waiting when you need it. And before we enter the world of Rome tonight, we have a question for you. Where in the world are you listening from right now? Drop your city and your local time in the comments below. Are you in New York at midnight? Los Angeles at 10 in the evening? London in the early hours? Wherever you are part of this story tonight. Now, make yourself comfortable. Let your body settle. Let your breathing slow. And let us walk together into the eternal city. The year is 753 BC, or so the Romans believed. A small collection of wooden huts sits on 7 hills above a slow brown river. The river is called the Tiber. The hills are covered in wild grass and oak trees, and the sounds of birds and insects. The air smells of river mud and wood smoke, and the particular sweetness of a Mediterranean evening in spring. There are perhaps a few hundred people here, farmers and shepherds mostly, living simple lives in a simple place. No one looking at those 7 hills on that spring evening would have predicted what was coming. No one would have believed that from this small beginning, the most powerful state in the history of the ancient world would grow. That these wooden huts would one day be replaced by marble temples and stone theaters and bathhouses that could hold thousands of people. That the small dirt paths between those huts would one day become a road network stretching 80,000 kilometers across 3 continents. That the language spoken around those evening fires would one day become the foundation of French and Spanish and Italian and Portuguese and Romanian. That the laws debated in a simple outdoor meeting place on one of those hills would one day form the basis of legal systems used across the Western world for 2,000 years. None of that was visible on that spring evening in 753 BC. There were just the hills, and the river, and the people, and the beginning of something that had no idea yet how large it would become. Let your eyes close now. Let the modern world fall away. And let the ancient city of Rome rise slowly around you, stone by stone, century by century. Tonight, it all belongs to you. Chapter 1, The 7 Hills, The Birth of Rome. Time period, 753-509 BC. Key figure, Romulus, the legendary founder. Major event, the founding of Rome and the Age of the Kings. What was built? The foundations of the Roman world. Every great city begins with a story, and Rome begins with 2 brothers and a she-wolf. The story goes like this. A Vestal virgin named Rhea Silvia, daughter of the rightful king of Alba Longa, was forced to become a priestess to prevent her from producing heirs who might threaten the throne. But the god Mars visited her, and she gave birth to twin boys. Their names were Romulus and Remus. The usurper king ordered the twins thrown into the Tiber River to drown. But the servants who carried out the order placed the babies in a basket instead. The basket floated downstream and came to rest at the foot of a hill called the Palatine. There, a she-wolf found the twins. She nursed them and kept them warm. A woodpecker brought them food. They survived. They were found by a shepherd named Faustulus, who raised them as his own. When they grew up, they overthrew the usurper, restored their grandfather to the throne, and set out to found a city of their own. They chose the 7 hills above the Tiber, but they could not agree on which hill the new city should be built upon. Romulus chose the Palatine. Remus chose the Aventine. They agreed to let the gods decide through the taking of omens, watching the flight of birds. Remus saw 6 vultures. Romulus saw 12. Romulus had 1. But Remus, furious, jumped over the low wall his brother had begun to build around his chosen hill. It was a symbolic act of contempt. Romulus, in a rage, killed him. Then he wept, and he named the new city after himself. Rome. This founding myth tells us something important about the Roman character. They were a people who understood that building something great sometimes required terrible sacrifice. That order sometimes came at a brutal cost. That the boundary, once drawn, had to be defended, even at the highest price. The historical reality of Rome's founding is, of course, more complicated and less dramatic. Modern archaeologists have found evidence of human habitation on the Palatine Hill dating to around the 10th century BC. Several small villages on the surrounding hills gradually merged over generations into a single larger community. This process of synoikismos, the coming together of separate communities into one, was probably slow and largely peaceful. But the Romans preferred the story of Romulus, and so that is the story they told. After Romulus came a series of kings. Roman tradition remembered 7 of them, though the early ones are certainly legendary. The second king, Numa Pompilius, was remembered as a peaceful and pious ruler who established many of Rome's religious institutions. He supposedly received guidance from a water nymph named Egeria, with whom he met in secret in a sacred grove outside the city. The fourth king, Ancus Marcius, expanded the city to the coast, establishing the port of Ostia at the mouth of the Tiber. This gave Rome access to the sea and to trade. The 5th, 6th, and 7th kings were Etruscan in origin. The Etruscans were the dominant civilization of central Italy at this time, sophisticated and wealthy and culturally advanced. Under Etruscan influence, Rome grew rapidly. The Forum, the great open space at the heart of the city, was drained and paved. The first temples were built in stone. The first proper sewage system, the Cloaca Maxima, was constructed. The Circus Maximus, where chariot races would one day draw hundreds of thousands of spectators, was laid out. Rome was becoming a real city, but the Romans deeply resented Etruscan rule. The last Etruscan king, Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud, was a tyrant in the most literal sense. He ruled by fear and violence. He murdered his predecessor. He trampled the body of his own father-in-law under the wheels of his chariot. He taxed and oppressed the Roman people without mercy. And when his son committed a terrible crime against a noble Roman woman named Lucretia, the Romans finally rose up. Lucretia, having told her father and husband what had happened to her, took her own life. Her kinsman, Lucius Junius Brutus, carried her body through the streets of Rome, using it to inflame the people against the king. Tarquin was expelled from the city. He died in exile, and the Romans swore a solemn oath. Never again would they be ruled by a king. The city on the 7 hills exhales in the warm evening air. The king is gone. The river moves slowly in the darkness below. Something new is beginning. Something that will shape the world for 1,000 years. Let your body rest now, heavy and warm. The ancient hills hold you gently. We move forward. Chapter 2. The Republic. When Rome learned to govern itself. Time period, 509–264 BC. Key figure, Cincinnatus. Major event, the establishment of the Roman Republic. What was created? A system of government that still influences the world. The word republic comes from the Latin residential publica, the public thing, the thing that belongs to everyone. After expelling their last king, the Romans created something remarkable, a system of government designed to prevent any one person from ever gaining too much power again. At the top of this system were two consuls, elected each year by the citizens of Rome. Two, not one, so that each could check the other. They held power for only a year, so that no one could accumulate too much authority. When their year was over, they returned to private life. This concept, the annual election of leaders who would return to ordinary citizenship when their term ended, was revolutionary. Below the consuls were other magistrates, praetors, who administered justice, quaestors, who managed the treasury, aediles, who maintained the city's infrastructure and organized public games, censors, who counted the citizens and assessed their wealth and moral character. All elected, all temporary, all subject to review by their peers. And above all of them, in theory if not always in practice, was the Senate. The Senate was a body of former magistrates and senior citizens who debated and directed Roman policy. They did not make laws directly, but their recommendations, their decrees, carried enormous moral weight. A senator who stood up in the forum and spoke against a proposed action could change the course of Roman history. The Senate was the institutional memory of Rome, the place where experience accumulated and wisdom, when it was present, was heard. The early republic was not a democracy in the modern sense. Political power was firmly in the hands of the patrician class, the old noble families of Rome. The plebeians, the common people, had little formal political voice at first, but they were not powerless. The plebeians had one extraordinary weapon. They could simply leave. On several occasions in the early republic, the plebeians of Rome simply walked out of the city en masse and set up camp on a nearby hill. They refused to work, refused to pay taxes, refused to serve in the army. These events are called the conflict of the orders. And they worked. Faced with a city that could not function without its common people, the patricians made concessions. The office of tribune of the plebs was created. Tribunes could veto any action by any magistrate. Their persons were declared sacrosanct, untouchable. Attacking a tribune was a crime against the state. The laws of Rome were written down for the first time on 12 bronze tablets displayed in the forum. The 12 tables, as they were called, ensured that the law was the same for everyone and could not be secretly changed by those in power. Gradually, plebeians gained access to more and more offices. By the middle of the Republic, the formal distinction between patrician and plebeian had lost most of its practical meaning. A new aristocracy of merit, the nobiles, those whose families had held high office, replaced the old aristocracy of birth. This flexibility was one of the great secrets of Roman success. When the system was under pressure, it adapted. It bent rather than breaking. The story of Cincinnatus captures the Roman ideal of this period perfectly. In 458 BC, Rome faced a military crisis. An army was surrounded and in danger. The Senate sent messengers to find Cincinnatus, a former consul who had retired to a small farm across the Tiber. They found him plowing his field. He was appointed dictator, a temporary emergency power the Romans granted when the situation was desperate. He crossed the river. He took command of the army. He defeated the enemy in a single day. He returned to Rome. He celebrated a triumph. And then, 15 days after being granted absolute power, he resigned. He went back to his farm. He went back to his plow. This story, whether entirely true or not, expresses something the Romans genuinely believed about themselves. That service to the state was a duty, not an opportunity for personal enrichment. That power was a burden to be carried temporarily, not a possession to be kept. That the greatest man was the one who gave up power most willingly. The forum is quiet now in the early evening. The marble gleams faintly in the fading light. Senators walk home through the narrow streets. their togas white against the golden stone. The Republic breathes. It is young and confident and full of itself. It does not yet know how far it will reach, nor what reaching that far will cost. Your breathing is slow and easy now. The ancient city rests around you. We move forward gently. Chapter 3. The Punic Wars. Rome against Carthage. Time period 264–146 BC. Key figure Hannibal Barca. Major event 3 wars that determined who would rule the Mediterranean. What was won? The world. There are moments in history when 2 forces meet and one of them must give way entirely. This is one of those moments. Carthage, a great city on the northern coast of Africa in what is now Tunisia. Founded by Phoenician traders from the eastern Mediterranean, Carthage had grown into the dominant power of the western Mediterranean world. Its merchant fleets controlled the trade routes. Its purple dye and silver and tin and slaves moved across the sea in quantities that made its merchants extraordinarily wealthy. Its armies, largely composed of mercenary soldiers from across the known world, protected its colonies and interests in Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, and Spain. For 2 centuries, Rome and Carthage had coexisted peacefully. They were different enough that they had not needed to compete. Rome was a land power. Carthage was a sea power. But as Rome expanded southward through Italy, the 2 powers began to bump against each other. And in 264 BC, a dispute over the island of Sicily brought them to war. The First Punic War lasted 23 years. It was fought largely at sea, which was a problem for Rome, which had almost no naval tradition. The Romans solved this problem in a characteristically Roman way. They copied. When a Carthaginian warship ran aground on the Italian coast, the Romans studied it carefully. They built copies. They trained crews. They added a new device of their own invention, a boarding bridge called the corvus, which could lock onto an enemy ship and turn a naval battle into a land battle. The Romans were very good at land battles. After 23 years of fighting, Carthage conceded Sicily. Rome had become a naval power almost overnight. But peace did not last. The Second Punic War, which began in 218 BC, was a very different kind of conflict. It produced one of the most extraordinary military campaigns in history, and one of the most gifted commanders who ever lived. His name was Hannibal Barca. Hannibal was the son of the Carthaginian general Hamilcar Barca, who had sworn, according to legend, to be an eternal enemy of Rome. He made his 9-year-old son swear the same oath. Hannibal kept that oath all his life. In 218 BC, Hannibal made a decision that must have seemed insane to anyone who heard of it. He decided to attack Rome. Not from the sea, not from Sicily, from Spain. He gathered an army of approximately 50,000 infantry, 9,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants. And he marched them northeast along the coast of Spain, across the Pyrenees Mountains, through southern France, and then across the Alps. The Alps in October. The Alps with elephants. The crossing was brutal. Snow and ice and rock slides and ambushes by hostile mountain tribes. By the time Hannibal descended into the Pie Valley of northern Italy, he had lost perhaps a third of his infantry, half his cavalry, and most of his elephants. But he was in Italy, and he proceeded to demonstrate why he was one of the greatest military commanders who ever lived. At the Battle of the Trebia River, he crushed a Roman army. At the Battle of Lake Trasimene, he crushed another. He set the perfect ambush on a foggy morning. 15,000 Romans died in the space of a few hours, trapped between the lake and Hannibal's hidden forces. And then came Cannae. In August 216 BC, at the town of Cannae in southern Italy, Hannibal faced the largest army Rome had ever assembled, approximately 80,000 Roman soldiers, against perhaps 50,000 Carthaginians. What happened at Cannae is still studied in military academies around the world today. Hannibal placed his weaker infantry in the center of his line, bulging forward toward the Romans. His stronger forces, his veterans, and his cavalry held the flanks. When the Romans attacked the center with their massive weight of numbers, the Carthaginian center gave way, but in a controlled retreat. The Romans followed, pressing forward, tightly packed, confident. And as they pressed forward, the flanks curved inward around them, like hands closing into fists. The Romans found themselves surrounded on all sides, packed so tightly they could barely raise their swords. By the end of the day, perhaps 70,000 Romans were dead. It was the worst defeat in Roman history. The word cannae has been used by military commanders ever since to describe the perfect encirclement. Hannibal had achieved something that seemed impossible. He had devastated Roman armies 3 times in succession. He controlled most of southern Italy. Several Italian cities and allies had defected to him. Many observers across the Mediterranean expected Rome to sue for peace. Rome did not sue for peace. This is perhaps the most remarkable thing about Rome in the entire Punic War period. After Cannae, after the loss of 70,000 men, the Roman Senate debated what to do. They did not consider surrender. They raised more legions. They stripped the temples of their votive offerings to make weapons. They freed slaves and armed them. They sent armies to Spain to cut off Hannibal's supply lines and reinforcements. And they waited. A new strategy emerged under a general named Quintus Fabius Maximus, nicknamed the Delayer. Fabius refused to meet Hannibal in open battle. Instead, he followed the Carthaginian army, harassing its supply lines, cutting off foraging parties, denying it the decisive victory it needed. Hannibal could devastate the Italian countryside, but without taking Rome itself, he could not win the war, and Rome's walls were too strong. Hannibal marched his army to within 3 miles of the city walls. He looked at them, and he turned away. He could not take them. Meanwhile, a young Roman commander named Publius Cornelius Scipio was achieving remarkable things in Spain. He drove the Carthaginians out of the Iberian Peninsula, and then he proposed something audacious. Carry the war to Africa. Take the fight to Carthage itself. The Senate agreed. Scipio landed in Africa in 204 BC. He allied with the Numidian king Massinissa, whose cavalry was the finest in the western Mediterranean. Carthage recalled Hannibal from Italy. After 16 years in Italy, Hannibal finally returned home. The 2 greatest commanders of their generation met at the Battle of Zama in 202 BC. Scipio used Hannibal's own tactics against him. He defeated Hannibal for the first and only time in Hannibal's life. Carthage surrendered. The Second Punic War was over. Scipio was given the honorary title Africanus. Scipio Africanus, the man who defeated Hannibal. Hannibal himself survived. He served Carthage as a statesman for years. He was eventually forced into exile when Rome demanded his surrender. He spent years as a refugee, offering his military genius to any king who would shelter him from Rome. But Rome was everywhere now. Eventually, surrounded and facing capture, Hannibal took poison. He is said to have remarked, before he died, that the Romans would not have to wait long for an old man's death. He died in Bithynia, in what is now Turkey, around 183 BC. The same year, by tradition, that his great enemy Scipio Africanus also died. Perhaps history arranged it that way. The Mediterranean is very quiet tonight. Its ancient water holds the memory of 1,000 battles. The stars above it are the same stars that navigators have sailed by for 3,000 years. The Punic Wars are over. Rome has won, and the world is about to change. As you rest now, deeply and still, history breathes around you. We move forward. Chapter 4. The Late Republic, when Rome nearly destroyed itself. Time period 133-27 BC. Key figure Julius Caesar. Major event: a century of civil war and the collapse of the Republic. What was lost? The dream of the residential publica. Power, once tasted, is very hard to give up. This is perhaps the central lesson of the late Roman Republic. The republic that had survived Hannibal would not survive its own success. The conquest of the Mediterranean world brought enormous wealth to Rome. But that wealth did not flow evenly. A small class of wealthy Romans used the profits of conquest to buy up vast agricultural estates worked by the enormous numbers of slaves that the wars had produced. Small farmers, many of them veterans who had served in those very wars, returned home to find that their land had been absorbed into these great estates. They could not compete with slave labor. They drifted into the cities, particularly Rome, where they formed a large, poor, and politically volatile class. Two brothers tried to address this problem. Tiberius Gracchus was elected tribune of the plebs in 133 BC. He proposed redistributing public land to the landless poor. It was a reasonable idea. It was bitterly opposed by the wealthy landowners in the Senate. Tiberius was surrounded by a mob of senators and their supporters and beaten to death with chairs and benches. His body was thrown into the Tiber. 10 years later, his brother Gaius made similar proposals. He was also killed. 2 reformers dead. The problems unsolved. The anger of the poor unaddressed. What followed was a century of violence and instability that the Romans themselves called the time of troubles. Military commanders discovered that the loyalty of their soldiers was personal, not institutional. A general who kept his men fed and paid and rewarded them with land when they retired could count on their absolute devotion. This was not loyalty to Rome. It was loyalty to the man. Gaius Marius, a brilliant general of non-noble background who reformed the Roman army from top to bottom, used this personal loyalty to dominate Roman politics in the late 2nd and early 1st centuries BC. He was elected consul an unprecedented 7 times. Then came Sulla, another great general, who marched his legions on Rome itself, something that had been unthinkable. He made himself dictator. He drew up proscription lists of citizens who were declared enemies of the state and could be killed by anyone. Their property was confiscated. Their killers received a reward. Sulla eventually resigned his dictatorship and retired. He died of natural causes, but the precedent he had set was catastrophic. Rome could be taken by force. The man with the legions made the law. Into this world came Gaius Julius Caesar. He was born in 100 BC into a patrician family of modest means. He was brilliant, charming, recklessly brave, and possessed of an ambition so enormous it eventually consumed everything around it. As a young man, he was captured by pirates in the Aegean Sea. He joked with them about the ransom they demanded, telling them it was too low for a man of his importance. He promised to come back and crucify them. When the ransom was paid and he was released, he raised a fleet, hunted the pirates down, captured them, and crucified every one of them. This story tells you almost everything you need to know about Julius Caesar. He kept his word, even when his word was a threat made to kidnappers. Caesar rose through the political ranks through a combination of military success and political genius. He formed a political alliance with 2 other powerful men, Pompey, the greatest general of his generation, and Crassus, the richest man in Rome. This alliance, which modern historians call the First Triumvirate though the Romans gave it no formal name, allowed Caesar to win the consulship in 59 BC. As consul, he passed legislation favorable to Pompey's veterans and Crassus's business interests, using popular assemblies to bypass a hostile Senate. The following year, he obtained command of the Roman province of Gaul. Gaul is what we now call France, Belgium, and parts of Switzerland and Germany. And over the following 9 years, Caesar conquered it. All of it. The Gallic Wars produced Caesar's own account of his campaigns, the Commentarii de Bello Gallico, one of the most elegant pieces of Latin prose ever written. Caesar writes about himself in the third person throughout. Caesar did this. Caesar ordered that. It is simultaneously modest in form and immodest in substance. The Gallic Wars were brutal. Caesar killed or enslaved perhaps 1 million Gauls. He broke the resistance of an entire civilization. The most famous episode was the Siege of Alesia in 52 BC. The Gallic leader Vercingetorix, a brilliant chieftain who had united most of Gaul against Rome, retreated with his army to the hilltop fortress of Alesia. Caesar built a wall around the entire fortress. Then, when a relief army arrived, he built a second wall facing outward. His army was sandwiched between two enemy forces, one inside, one outside. He held both walls. He broke both armies. Vercingetorix surrendered. He was kept alive for Caesar's triumph in Rome, then strangled in prison. The conquest of Gaul made Caesar the most powerful man in the Roman world. His army was the finest fighting force alive. His soldiers were loyal to him personally. He was wealthy beyond imagination from the spoils of war, and the Senate was terrified of him. They ordered him to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. Caesar had a choice: comply and face almost certain prosecution and ruin, or defy the Senate. On the night of January 10th, 49 BC, Caesar stood on the northern bank of the Rubicon River, the boundary between his province and Italy proper. To cross the Rubicon with an army was an act of war against the Roman state. He paused. He considered. The ancient sources say he quoted a line from the Greek playwright Menander. The die is cast. He crossed the river. Civil war had begun. His opponent was Pompey, his former ally now turned enemy. Pompey retreated to Greece. Caesar followed. At the Battle of Pharsalus in 48 BC, Caesar defeated Pompey decisively. Pompey fled to Egypt, where he was murdered by agents of the Egyptian king who hoped to win Caesar's favor. Caesar arrived in Egypt shortly after. He was shown Pompey's head. He wept. Pompey had been his son-in-law once, his ally for years. Whatever their quarrel, Pompey deserved a better death. In Egypt, Caesar met Cleopatra VII, the last of the Ptolemaic rulers. She was brilliant, multilingual, and determined to use Caesar's power to secure her own throne. She reportedly had herself delivered to Caesar rolled in a carpet or linen sack to avoid her brother's guards. The two became allies and lovers. Caesar fought off a siege in Alexandria, restored Cleopatra to her throne, and sailed back to Rome. He was now master of the Roman world. He was appointed dictator, then dictator for 10 years, then dictator perpetuo, dictator in perpetuity, for life. The Roman Republic, technically, still existed. But in practice, Caesar was a king. He knew the Romans' hatred of kings. He declined the crown when it was offered to him at a public ceremony, 3 times, as if reluctantly. But the gestures convinced no one. A conspiracy formed. Senators and former allies who feared Caesar's absolute power, who believed, genuinely or conveniently, that they were saving the Republic. Their leaders were 2 men with strong Republican principles: Marcus Junius Brutus, Caesar's close friend, and Gaius Cassius Longinus. On March 15, 44 BC, the Ides of March, Caesar walked to the theater of Pompey where the Senate was meeting that day. He was warned not to go. His wife Calpurnia had dreamed of his death. A soothsayer had warned him to beware the Ides of March. He went anyway. As he took his seat, the conspirators surrounded him. One of them, as if to present a petition, grabbed his toga. The signal. The daggers came out. 23 wounds. Caesar fell at the base of a statue of Pompey. Dead at 55, the conspirators had saved the Republic, or so they thought. What followed was another round of civil war, more brutal than the last. Caesar's heir, his great-nephew Octavian, allied with Caesar's lieutenant Mark Antony to destroy the assassins. Then Octavian and Antony turn on each other. Their conflict was resolved at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, where Octavian's navy defeated the combined fleet of Antony and Cleopatra. Antony and Cleopatra fled to Egypt. Antony, believing Cleopatra was dead, fell on his sword. Cleopatra, unwilling to be paraded through Rome in Octavian's triumph, died by her own hand. The ASP, the sacred cobra, Egypt fell to Rome. The last independent kingdom in the Mediterranean world was gone, and Octavian, sole ruler of the Roman world, returned to Rome. He was 32 years old. The Republic was dying. Something new was about to be born. The city is very quiet tonight. The Forum gleams in the moonlight. The statues of the senators stand in their marble silence. And a young man with cold eyes and a patient heart is planning. As you rest now, the ancient stones around you warm with the long memory of everything that happened here. We move forward into the age of the emperors. Chapter 5, Augustus, the man who became a god. Time period, 27 BC, 14 AD. Key figure, Augustus Caesar. Major event, the transformation of Rome from republic to empire. What was created? The Pax Romana, 2 centuries of peace. His name at birth was Gaius Octavius. He was a slight, physically unimpressive young man, prone to illness, not naturally a soldier, not naturally a speaker, not naturally a leader in any obvious, charismatic way. And yet he outlasted and outmaneuvered every single person who stood against him. He ruled Rome for 41 years. He transformed it from a blood-soaked wreck of civil war into the most prosperous and stable state the Western world had ever seen. And he did it all while maintaining the fiction that he was simply the first citizen of the Republic. Not a king, never a king, just the princeps, the first man. In 27 BC, Octavian staged a careful political theater. He appeared before the Senate and announced that he was returning all his extraordinary powers to the Senate and the Roman people. The Republic was restored. The Senate was so horrified at the prospect of losing their powerful protector that they immediately begged him to take the powers back. He accepted, reluctantly, modestly, as a loyal servant of the state. The Senate gave him a new name, Augustus, the revered one, a name with religious overtones, almost divine, almost, but not quite, a king. Augustus spent the next 40 years carefully redesigning every institution of Roman government to ensure that power flowed through him without ever officially belonging to him. He was consul, or held consular power. He held tribunician power permanently. He was Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of Rome. He commanded all the provinces where armies were stationed. He did not call himself king or dictator. He called himself princeps and imperator. From imperator, through a long chain of history, comes the word emperor. Augustus also transformed the physical city of Rome. He famously boasted that he found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. This was not quite literally true, but the spirit of it was accurate. He rebuilt temples, built new ones, restored roads and aqueducts. He built the Forum of Augustus with its great temple of Mars the Avenger. He completed Caesar's building projects. He began the process of monumentalizing the city that would continue for centuries. The Era Pacis, the Altar of Peace, commissioned by the Senate to celebrate Augustus's return from military campaigns in Gaul and Spain, still stands in Rome today. It shows the imperial family in a solemn procession, carved in white marble with extraordinary delicacy. The faces are recognizable. The children are restless and being quietly managed by their parents. 2,000 years old and entirely human. Under Augustus, the arts flourished. Virgil wrote the Aeneid, the great Roman national epic telling the story of the Trojan hero Aeneas and his journey to found the Roman race. It was Rome's answer to Homer. Its last lines, still unrevised, still contain a gap that the dying Virgil had not yet filled. He asked Augustus to destroy it on his death. Augustus refused. The Aeneid survived. Horace wrote his odes, lyric poems of extraordinary grace and compressed wisdom. Livy wrote his great history of Rome from its founding to his own time. Ovid wrote his Metamorphoses, a retelling of the great myths of the ancient world in flowing hexameter verse. Then he made the mistake of writing the Ars Amatoria, a witty and mildly scandalous handbook for lovers, and was exiled by Augustus to the distant shores of the Black Sea. He died there, still writing, still hoping to be recalled. He never was. Augustus was not sentimental about those who crossed him or embarrassed him, but he was genuinely committed to the welfare of the Roman people and the stability of the state. He reformed the army, giving soldiers fixed terms of service and guaranteed retirement payments. He created the Praetorian Guard, an elite bodyguard unit stationed in Rome. He established fire brigades and police forces for the city. He created a postal system that connected the empire. He extended Roman power in Spain and the eastern provinces. He tried to extend it into Germany, and here he met his one great failure. In 9 AD, 3 Roman legions under the command of Publius Quinctilius Varus were ambushed in the Teutoburg forest by a Germanic coalition led by a chieftain named Arminius. Arminius, who had served in the Roman army and knew its tactics well, led the legions into a trap. In 3 days of fighting in the rain and mud of the German forest, 20,000 Roman soldiers died. Varus fell on his sword. It was Rome's worst military disaster since Cannae. Augustus, old now, was reportedly seen wandering his palace at night, beating his head against the walls. Varus, give me back my legions. He never recovered from it. The Rhine River became Rome's permanent northern frontier. Germany was never conquered. Augustus died in 14 AD at the age of 75. He died in Nola, in southern Italy, in the arms of his wife Livia. His last words, according to various accounts, were playful. He asked whether he had played his part in the comedy of life well, and if so, to send him off with applause. He had played his part extraordinarily well. The empire he left behind would last, in various forms, for another 4.5 centuries in the west and another 15 centuries in the east. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace that began with Augustus, gave the Mediterranean world 2 centuries of relative stability. 2 centuries in which trade flourished and roads were built and cities grew and the arts and sciences advanced. 2 centuries that people living in them may well have regarded as something close to a golden age. The evening air in Rome is warm and still. The marble of the Era Pacis glows faintly in the moonlight. The city sleeps. The first emperor rests in his mausoleum by the river, and the empire stretches from Scotland to Syria, from Morocco to Mesopotamia, vast and peaceful and warm, as you are now, vast in your dreaming, peaceful in your rest. We move forward, gently, into the centuries of the emperors. Chapter 6. The Good Emperors and the Mad Ones. Time period, 180 AD. Key figure, Marcus Aurelius and Caligula. Major event, the height and the depths of imperial Rome. What was revealed? The best and worst of human nature at its most powerful. Power reveals character. This is one of the consistent lessons of Roman imperial history. Give a person absolute power, freedom from all restraint, the ability to do literally anything they wish to anyone in the world, and you will find out very quickly what they are made of. Some emperors were made of extraordinary stuff. Others were revealed to be something far darker. Tiberius, Augustus's stepson and successor, began competently and grew increasingly paranoid and cruel. He eventually retreated to the island of Capri and rarely returned to Rome. The administration fell to his praetorian prefect, Sejanus, who used his proximity to power to pursue personal vendettas and accumulate influence. When Tiberius finally had Sejanus arrested and executed, the purge that followed was wide and terrifying. Tiberius died in 37 AD, and Rome was not sorry to see him go. What followed was Caligula. Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, known as Caligula, the Little Booed, a childhood nickname given to him by soldiers who adored his father Germanicus, came to power at 24. The first months of his reign were celebrated. He was generous, humane, inclusive. Rome breathed with relief. Then something changed. Whether it was a serious illness he suffered early in his reign, whether it was the corrupting effect of absolute power, whether he was always unstable and had simply hidden it, we cannot know. What we know is the behavior the ancient sources describe. Caligula executed people for entertainment. He humiliated senators by making them run beside his litter for miles. He reportedly made his horse a consul, though some historians think this was a deliberate insult to the Senate rather than a sign of madness. He declared himself a god and had temples built to himself. He was assassinated by members of the Praetorian Guard in 41 AD after a reign of less than 4 years. His uncle Claudius, whom the family had largely ignored due to a limp and a stutter, was found hiding behind a curtain in the palace after the assassination and proclaimed emperor by the Praetorian Guard. Claudius turned out to be an effective and humane ruler. He conquered Britain in 43 AD, a century after Julius Caesar had made 2 exploratory raids on the island. He expanded Roman citizenship. He built new harbors and aqueducts. He was eventually poisoned, probably by his wife Agrippina the Younger, who wanted the throne for her son by a previous marriage. Her son was Nero. Nero began his reign at 17, guided by the philosopher Seneca and the Praetorian prefect Burrus. For 5 years, the government of Rome was remarkably good. Then the guidance ended, and Nero revealed himself. He had his mother Agrippina killed. He had his first wife Octavia executed. He kicked his second wife Poppaea to death while she was pregnant. He reportedly fiddled while Rome burned, which is almost certainly not literally true, but captures something real about his detachment and self-absorption. The Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD burned for 9 days and destroyed large parts of the city. Nero rebuilt lavishly, creating his extraordinary private palace, the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, a complex so vast that Nero reportedly said he was at last beginning to be housed like a human being. He blamed the fire on a small new sect called the Christians, initiating the first systematic persecution of Christianity in Rome. When revolt finally came, when governors in the provinces rose against him and the Senate condemned him as a public enemy, Nero panicked. He fled with a small group of freedmen. He tried to stab himself, but could not find the courage. A freedman had to help him. His last recorded words were, "What an artist dies in me." After the chaos of 69 AD, the year of 4 emperors, the Flavian dynasty brought stability. Vespasian, a practical, unsentimental general from a non-aristocratic background, established order. He began the construction of the Colosseum, built on the site of Nero's artificial lake. His son Titus completed it. When the Colosseum opened in 80 AD, the inaugural games lasted 100 days. That same year, Mount Vesuvius erupted. Pompeii and Herculaneum were buried under ash and pumice. The communities were preserved almost perfectly. When archaeologists began excavating them in the 18th century, they found a Roman town frozen in a single moment. Loaves of bread still in the ovens, graffiti on the walls, political slogans, romantic declarations, crude jokes, the casts of people who had died in the eruption, their last positions preserved in the hardened ash. A dog on a chain, a man covering his face, a woman clutching her children. 2,000 years ago, and still heartbreaking. The Flavians were followed by the adoptive emperors, a series of rulers who chose their successors by adoption rather than biology. This system produced what the historian Edward Gibbon called the period in the history of the world during which the condition of the human race was most happy and prosperous. Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, Marcus Aurelius. 5 consecutive able, conscientious rulers spanning nearly a century. Trajan, born in Spain, the first emperor born outside Italy, pushed the empire to its greatest extent. He conquered Dacia, roughly modern Romania, and added it to the empire. Trajan's column in Rome, still standing, records his campaigns in continuous carved narratives spiraling up the shaft. Hadrian, his successor, was more interested in consolidation than expansion. He traveled the empire continuously, personally inspecting every province. He built Hadrian's Wall across northern Britain to mark and defend the northern frontier. He rebuilt the Pantheon in Rome, whose great dome, still perfectly intact today, was for over 1,000 years the largest in the world. Marcus Aurelius was the last of the 5 good emperors and perhaps the greatest of them all. He was also a philosopher, a practitioner of Stoic philosophy, which held that virtue alone constituted the good life and that external circumstances, wealth, power, health, even life itself, were indifferent things. His private journal, the Meditations, written in Greek during military campaigns on the Danube frontier, was never intended for publication. It is a record of a person trying, imperfectly and honestly, to live according to their principles while governing the most powerful state in the world. It is still read today. Its wisdom has not aged. Begin the morning by saying to yourself, I shall meet with the busy, the ungrateful, arrogant, deceitful, envious, unsocial. All these things happen to them by reason of their ignorance of what is good and evil. Marcus Aurelius died in 180 AD on the Danube frontier. He was fighting the German tribes who were pressing against the empire's borders with increasing force. He died not in Rome, but in the cold north, doing his duty to the last. The stars above the Danube tonight are very cold and very clear. The tents of the Roman army stretch along the riverbank. Sentries walk slowly in the dark, and somewhere in the commander's tent, a philosopher emperor is writing in his journal. Words that will outlast the empire. Words that will still be read when every stone of that empire has been swallowed by the earth. As your own thoughts grow slow and gentle now, as your mind moves toward the quiet country of sleep, history holds you, and you rest. Chapter 7, Roman Daily Life, Inside the Empire. Time period, 1st to 2nd century AD. Key figure, ordinary Roman citizens. Major event, daily life at the height of the empire. What was lived? The real texture of the ancient world. Let us leave the emperors for a moment. Let us walk away from the palace on the Palatine Hill and into the streets of Rome. Into the ordinary, extraordinary life of the city. Rome at its height contained perhaps 1 million people. It was the largest city in the Western world, larger than any European city would be again until London in the 18th century. The streets were narrow and crowded. Insulated, multi-story apartment buildings crowded the residential neighborhoods. Some rose to 6 or 7 stories. They were poorly built, often fire-prone, and could collapse without warning. The ground floors were occupied by shops and relatively prosperous tenants. The higher you lived, the worse the conditions. No running water above the ground floor. Buckets for waste that had to be carried down, or not carried down, a source of constant complaint from people walking in the streets below. The city smelled of people and cooking and animals and the contents of the fuller's shops, where urine collected from public urinals was used to clean and bleach wool. It was noisy. Wheeled vehicles were banned from the streets during daylight hours to reduce congestion, so merchants and delivery men drove their carts through the city at night. The noise kept people awake. The satirist Juvenal complained bitterly about it. But the city also had extraordinary beauty. Public fountains supplied fresh water continuously. Aqueducts brought water from sources miles away. Some of the masterpieces of engineering that crossed valleys on multi-tiered stone arches. The Aqua Virgo, built in 19 BC, still supplies the Trevi Fountain today. The bathhouses, the thermae, were social institutions. Large bathhouses had hot rooms and warm rooms and cold rooms. Swimming pools, exercise yards, libraries, gardens, snack shops. For the price of a small coin, any Roman citizen, rich or poor, could spend the afternoon at the baths. Bathing was not a private act in Rome. It was a social occasion. People met at the baths to talk business, make friends, discuss politics, and conduct every kind of social interaction. The food of Rome came from across the empire. Grain from Egypt and North Africa, so much of it that Egypt was called the breadbasket of the empire. Olive oil from Spain and Greece. Wine from Italy, Gaul, and the eastern provinces. Fish sauce, garum, the Romans' universal condiment, fermented from fish guts. It smelled terrible to modern noses, but the Romans put it on everything. Spices from India and Arabia, pepper and cinnamon and cardamom, expensive luxuries that traveled the Silk Road to reach the empire's markets. Roman cookbooks survive, most notably the Apicius, a collection of recipes from the 1st century AD. They are recognizable and strange simultaneously. Roasted meats with fruit and honey sauces, elaborate seafood dishes, a surprising number of sweet and savory combinations, and the famous dormice, the tiny rodents fattened in special jars and then roasted in honey and poppy seeds. A delicacy for the wealthy. The Romans were also obsessed with public entertainment. The Colosseum held perhaps 50,000 spectators. Gladiatorial games were elaborate productions with professional fighters, exotic animals, naval battles staged in the flooded arena, and theatrical executions. The chariot races in the Circus Maximus drew even larger crowds. The circus held perhaps 250,000 people. The chariot teams, divided into the blues, greens, reds, and whites, had devoted fan clubs that would make modern sports supporters look restrained. Riots broke out regularly, but Roman life was not only entertainment and spectacle. It was also family and work and religion and neighborhood. The Roman family was legally headed by the paterfamilias, the father of the family, who in theory held the power of life and death over all his dependents. In practice, Roman family life shows considerable warmth and affection in its surviving record. Letters between family members are full of ordinary concern. Are you eating properly? Did you receive the money I sent? How is your health? How are the children? 2,000 years ago, and entirely familiar. Children were precious and often lost. Infant mortality was high. Children who survived were loved intensely. Toys found in excavations include dolls with movable limbs, miniature furniture, balls and hoops. The childhood of a Roman child was not so different from a childhood anywhere. The streets of Rome are quieter now. The afternoon heat is fading. Shadows stretch long across the cobblestones. The smell of evening cooking drifts from open windows. A child calls out from somewhere above. A dog barks once and then is quiet. The city breathes its ancient breath, and you breathe with it. Slowly, peacefully, we move forward. Chapter 8. The Colosseum. Stone, sand, and spectacle. Time period, 72, 80 AD and beyond. Key figure, the gladiators. Major event, the construction and use of the Colosseum. What was built? The most iconic building in Roman history. Let us stand here for a moment, in the shadow of the Colosseum. It rises around us, a vast oval of travertine marble and brick, tiered and perfect. Its outer wall stands over 48 meters high. Its perimeter stretches 627 meters. It could hold between 50 and 80,000 spectators. It was completed in 80 AD under the Emperor Titus. He inaugurated it with 100 days of games. Standing inside it today, even in its ruined state, even stripped of its marble cladding and its wooden seating and its complex systems of trapdoors and lifts, is extraordinary. The scale is human enough to comprehend. You can see every seat from every other seat. You can imagine the crowd, the noise they would have made, the smell of sand and blood and 50,000 human beings on a hot summer afternoon. The gladiators who fought here were not, for the most part, unwilling victims. Many were volunteers. The life of a gladiator was brutal and dangerous, certainly, but it also offered something that very few other options provided for men at the bottom of Roman society: fame. A successful gladiator was celebrated, admired, desired. Graffiti found in Pompeii celebrates gladiators like modern sports celebrities. Suspirium Puellarum, the sigh of the girls, was written next to the name of one successful fighter. Gladiators trained in schools called ludi under professional trainers. They received medical care of a surprisingly high standard. The physician Galen, one of the greatest doctors of the ancient world, served as physician to a gladiatorial school in Pergamon and learned much of his anatomy from treating their wounds. The fights in the arena were not always to the death. Killing a trained gladiator was expensive, the equivalent of destroying valuable equipment. Fights were often decided when one man was clearly beaten and either called for mercy or the crowd indicated it. The editor, the official presiding over the games, would then decide whether the loser lived or died. The crowd's wishes carried significant weight, but the animal hunts, the venations, were genuine slaughter. Exotic animals from across the empire, lions and tigers and bears and elephants and giraffes and hippopotamuses, were brought to Rome at enormous expense and killed in the arena for the crowd's entertainment. The impact on animal populations in North Africa and the Middle East was significant. Hippos became extinct in the Nile. Lions disappeared from much of their former range. Elephants retreated south. The Colosseum was not the only arena in the empire. Every major Roman city had one. The games were a fundamental part of Roman public culture. They were also, in time, a source of growing unease. Not initially from within Roman society, which largely accepted them as traditional, but from the new religion that was spreading through the empire. Christianity would eventually end the games. But that story belongs to a later chapter. For now, the arena is quiet. The sand has been raked clean. The last of the afternoon light falls through the open top and makes long golden bars across the stone. A bird moves through the empty space, its wings catching the light. The Colosseum has outlasted the empire that built it. It has outlasted the medieval scavengers who stripped its marble. It has outlasted the Renaissance builders who used its stone for palaces and churches. It still stands, still vast, still humbling. A reminder that human beings are capable of extraordinary things, good and terrible in equal measure. The stone is warm from the sun. The evening air is soft. The ancient world breathes around you, and you rest. Chapter 9: Roads, Aqueducts, and the Engineering of Empire. Time period: throughout Roman history. Key figure: Roman engineers. Major event: the construction of the Roman infrastructure. What was built? The physical body of the empire. All roads lead to Rome. This saying is not merely metaphorical. The Roman road network stretched approximately 80,000 kilometers across the empire. Engineers surveyed each road carefully before construction began. They were built to last, and they did. Some Roman roads are still in use today, either as modern roads laid over their course or as the routes that modern highways follow. The construction of a Roman road was a precise and laborious process. Workers first dug down to the subsoil, sometimes several feet. They laid a foundation of large stones set in mortar, then a layer of smaller stones and gravel, then a layer of concrete. The Romans' extraordinary invention, which they called opus caementitium, then a surface of carefully fitted paving stones, slightly crowned in the center so that rainwater drained to the sides. Drainage channels ran alongside. Milestones marked every Roman mile, approximately 1,480 meters. The roads were straight because straight is faster. Where the land was flat, Roman roads ran in perfectly straight lines for miles. Where terrain forced a deviation, they made the smallest deviation possible. The Waddling Street in Britain, which runs from Dover through London to Wroxeter, follows essentially the same course today that the Romans laid it on 2,000 years ago. The roads served multiple purposes. They allowed armies to move quickly across the empire. A Roman legion could march 40 kilometers a day on a good road. They allowed the postal service, the cursus publicus, to operate efficiently. An imperial messenger could travel the length of Gaul in a week. They allowed merchants to move goods. They allowed ideas and diseases, unfortunately, to travel. The bubonic plague that struck the empire in the reign of Marcus Aurelius, the Antonine Plague, spread along those beautiful roads. It killed perhaps 5 million people. The aqueducts were equally extraordinary. Rome at its height was served by 11 major aqueducts, bringing water from sources up to 90 kilometers away. The combined flow was approximately 1 million cubic meters of water per day. For a city of 1 million people. That is more water per person per day than many modern cities supply. The aqueducts had to maintain a precise, constant slight downhill gradient across their entire length. Where the terrain dropped, the water was carried on arches. The Pont du Gard in southern France, built in the 1st century AD to carry the Nîmes aqueduct across the Gardon River, still stands today. It is 50 meters high and 270 meters long. 3 tiers of arches, the upper one carrying the water channel, the lower ones providing crossing for people and animals. It was built without mortar. The stones were cut so precisely that they interlock by their own weight. After 2,000 years, not one has moved. The Romans also understood concrete in a way that would not be rediscovered until the 19th century. Roman marine concrete, used in harbor walls and sea structures, has actually become stronger over time as seawater has reacted with the volcanic ash in its composition. Modern concrete degrades in seawater within decades. Roman concrete in harbor walls in Italy is still intact after 2,000 years, and still getting stronger. The Pantheon's dome, unreinforced Roman concrete cast 2,000 years ago, is still the largest unreinforced concrete dome in the world. No one has built a larger one without steel reinforcement. The Romans also built bridges, some of which survive. They built harbors and lighthouses and drains and sewers. They built walls that marked the edges of the world as they knew it. Hadrian's Wall in northern England. The Aurelian Wall around Rome itself. The limes, the fortified frontier that ran along the Rhine and Danube rivers. These structures were not merely practical. They were statements. Statements about what Rome was and what lay beyond its borders. Civilization and order on one side, something else on the other. The road stretches before you now, straight and wide and ancient. The paving stones are warm from the day's sun. The milestones stand at regular intervals in the evening shadow. And the road goes on and on and on, into the distance, into history, as you drift now along your own quiet road, into the gentle country of sleep. Chapter 10, Christianity, the new faith that would change everything. Time period, 1st to 4th century AD. Key figure, Jesus of Nazareth and the Emperor Constantine. Major event, the birth and spread of Christianity. What was transformed? The spiritual life of the entire Western world. Something was happening in the eastern provinces of the empire. Something small at first, barely visible. In the reign of the Emperor Tiberius, in a small Roman province called Judea, a Jewish preacher named Jesus of Nazareth was crucified by the Roman authorities on the request of the local religious leaders. He was probably in his early 30s. His execution was not a significant event from Rome's perspective. Roman provincial authorities crucified troublemakers regularly. It was an effective deterrent. Public, slow, humiliating. A warning to others. But this particular execution did not have the usual deterrent effect. The small community of followers that Jesus had gathered did not disperse. They reported that their teacher had risen from the dead, and they began to spread this message, slowly, through the Jewish communities of the Eastern Mediterranean. Then, through the mission of a man named Paul of Tarsus, a Roman citizen who had initially persecuted Christians before a dramatic conversion, the message spread to the non-Jewish world, to Greece, to Rome itself, to communities across the empire. What made Christianity so attractive in this world? Many things. It offered a personal relationship with a divine being who knew and cared about the individual. In a world of vast, impersonal states and distant gods who needed elaborate temples and priestly intermediaries, this was remarkable. It offered community. Christian congregations cared for their sick and their poor in ways that Roman society generally did not. It offered hope, a life after death not reserved for heroes or the very wealthiest, but available to everyone. It offered meaning, a framework for understanding suffering that made it not pointless but redemptive. And it was free. No expensive sacrifices were required. No elaborate initiation. Just belief and community and a new way of living. The early Christian communities in Rome faced periodic persecution. Nero blamed them for the Great Fire. Later emperors persecuted them intermittently when they proved unwilling to make token sacrifices to the Roman gods, an act of civic loyalty that Christians considered idolatry. But persecution, paradoxically, strengthened the community. The willingness of Christians to die for their faith was understood by many observers not as stubbornness, but as evidence of the truth of what they believed. Why would someone die for a lie? By the early 4th century, Christianity had spread throughout the empire and beyond. It was still illegal, still persecuted, but it was everywhere. And then the emperor changed. Constantine I came to power in 306 AD through a complex series of civil wars. Before a crucial battle at the Milvian Bridge in 312 AD, he reportedly saw a vision or a sign. In later accounts, it was a cross of light in the sky with the words in this sign, "Conquer." Whether the vision was genuine, politically calculated, or something in between, Constantine issued the Edict of Milan in 313 AD. Christianity was legalized, no longer persecuted, protected. Constantine himself converted, though he was not baptized until on his deathbed. He built churches across the empire. He convened the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD to settle theological disputes and define Orthodox Christian doctrine. The Nicene Creed, still recited in churches around the world today, was the product of that council. The emperor, who was himself worshipped as a god, was now a worshipper of the Christian God. The implications were enormous. Within decades, Christianity went from being a persecuted minority religion to the official religion of the Roman state. The old temples began to close. The old gods faded. The intellectual and artistic resources of the empire were redirected toward the new faith. The cathedrals and monasteries that would define European culture for the next 1,000 years began to be built. The world had changed. Quietly, slowly, and then all at once. The candles burn low in the early Christian basilica. The smell of incense is thick and sweet. Somewhere in the darkness of the building, a choir is singing. The notes rise and fall and rise again. Ancient music, ancient words, still being sung in some form, somewhere in the world tonight. As you rest in your own quiet room, warm and safe, the old world changing into the new. We move forward. Chapter 11. The Crisis of the 3rd Century, when Rome nearly fell. Time period 235–284 AD. Key figure: the soldier emperors. Major event: 50 years of political chaos and military crisis. What was nearly lost? The empire itself. There is a period in Roman history that historians call the crisis of the 3rd century. It lasted from 235 to 284 AD. 50 years. And in those 50 years, Rome came closer to complete collapse than at any other point in its long history. The trouble began with the murder of the Emperor Alexander Severus by his own troops in 235 AD. The soldiers wanted a fighting emperor, not a scholarly one. They elevated one of their own, a man named Maximinus Thrax, a Thracian of reportedly enormous physical size and strength. Maximinus was the first emperor of completely non-Roman, non-senatorial origin, and he was the first crack in the dam. What followed was extraordinary. Between 235 and 284 AD, the Roman Empire had approximately 50 different emperors. Some ruled for years. Many ruled for months. Some for days. Most were killed by their own soldiers when they failed to deliver what was expected. Battles won, donatives paid, the frontier held. The soldiers made and unmade emperors with casual brutality. The consequences for the empire were devastating. The frontier defenses that had held for generations began to fail. Germanic tribes crossed the Rhine and Danube repeatedly, penetrating deep into the empire. The Goths raided into Greece and Asia Minor. The Persian Empire under the new Sassanid dynasty pushed aggressively into the eastern provinces. In 260 AD, the worst happened. The Emperor Valerian was defeated by the Persian king Shapur I at the Battle of Edessa. He was captured. A Roman emperor taken alive by a foreign king. He died in captivity. The empire splintered. The western provinces separated under a series of breakaway emperors, the Gallic Empire. The eastern provinces coalesced under the rule of Zenobia, the remarkable queen of Palmyra in the Syrian desert. Zenobia was one of the most extraordinary figures of the ancient world. She claimed descent from Cleopatra. She was a skilled military commander, a scholar who spoke Egyptian, Aramaic, Greek, and Latin, and an ambitious political figure who declared herself Augusta, Empress, and her son Augustus, Emperor. She led her army against Roman forces and won. She conquered Egypt. She extended her control across the Middle East. She was eventually defeated by the Emperor Aurelian in 272 AD, captured, and brought to Rome. Aurelian, to his credit, treated her with remarkable respect. She was paraded through Rome in chains of gold rather than iron. She was given a villa near Tivoli where she lived in comfort for years. Some accounts say she converted to philosophy. Others say she converted to Christianity. The empire was reunited by Aurelian, who was then murdered by his secretaries over a personal dispute. The crisis continued until Diocletian took power in 284 AD. Diocletian was a practical, systematic man. He saw clearly that the empire had become too large for one man to govern effectively. He divided it. He ruled the eastern half himself, with a co-emperor in the west. He also created 2 junior emperors, one for each half. This system, the tetrarchy, the rule of 4, provided 4 centers of power and 4 armies to defend the frontiers. Diocletian also completely reformed the army, the tax system, and the administration. He fixed prices in an attempt to control inflation. He launched the last and most systematic persecution of Christianity, perhaps sensing that a new, universal religion that owed no loyalty to Rome might be destabilizing. In 305 AD, Diocletian did something no emperor since Sulla had done voluntarily. He retired. He stepped down from power of his own free will. He went to his palace and split, in what is now Croatia, and grew cabbages. When his former colleagues tried to persuade him to return to power, he is said to have replied that if they could see the cabbages he had planted with his own hands, they would not try to persuade him. Diocletian lived for 8 more years in his garden by the Adriatic Sea. He died peacefully, in his bed. The Adriatic is very quiet tonight. The ruins of Diocletian's palace are full of moonlight. His cabbages are long gone, but the walls he built still stand. They are still inhabited. People live and work inside them today. A Roman emperor's retirement home, still functioning after 17 centuries. The world rests in the fading warmth of a long day. And so do you. Peacefully now. Deeply. We move forward. Chapter 12. Constantine and the New Rome. Time period: 306-337 AD. Key figure: Constantine the Great. Major event: the founding of Constantinople. What was created? A second Rome that would outlast the first by 1,000 years. We have already met Constantine in the context of Christianity, but he deserves a chapter of his own, because what he did in 330 AD changed the shape of the world as profoundly as anything any emperor before him had done. He moved the capital. The city of Rome, on its 7 hills above the Tiber, had been the center of the Roman world for over 1,000 years. Its population, its institutions, its monuments, its traditions, all of it had accumulated over centuries into the most complex and richly layered urban center in the Western world. But Rome was not, by the 4th century, a very practical capital for the empire. It was far from the frontiers. The Rhine and Danube, where the most serious military threats lay, were closer to Trier in Germany or Milan in northern Italy than to Rome. The eastern frontier, where Persia threatened, was thousands of miles away. Constantine wanted a new capital. He chose a site on the European shore of the Bosphorus, the narrow strait that connects the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. A small Greek city called Byzantium had stood there for centuries. The location was extraordinary. It sat at the meeting point of Europe and Asia. It controlled the sea route between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. It was surrounded on 3 sides by water, naturally defensible. It was at the center, geographically, of the empire. Constantine built there with remarkable speed and ambition. He modeled the new city directly on Rome. It had 7 hills. It had a forum with a column at its center. It had a senate. It had a hippodrome for chariot races next to the imperial palace. It had its own version of the Capitoline Hill. He called it Nova Roma, New Rome. But the people called it Constantinople, the city of Constantine. It was dedicated on May 11th, 330 AD. A city had been built in 4 years. Constantine stripped monuments from across the empire to decorate it. The serpent column from the Temple of Apollo at Delphi, erected by the Greeks after the Battle of Plataea in 479 BC, was placed in the Hippodrome. It is still there today, still in Istanbul. Over 2,500 years old, Constantinople grew rapidly into one of the great cities of the world. By the 5th and 6th centuries, it had perhaps 500,000 people. It was the largest city in Europe. When the Western Roman Empire fell in 476 AD, Constantinople kept going. The Eastern Roman Empire, which we call the Byzantine Empire, survived for another 1,000 years after the fall of the West. It fell, finally, to the Ottoman Turks under Mehmed II in 1453 AD. Constantinople became Istanbul. The city of Constantine is now the largest city in Turkey, home to 15 million people. But its bones are still Roman. Its greatest building, the Hagia Sophia, built by the Emperor Justinian in the 6th century, is still standing, still beautiful, still moving visitors to silence with the weight of what they feel inside it. The Bosphorus is very still tonight. The lights of Istanbul shimmer in its dark water. Europe on one side, Asia on the other. The ancient strait between them, moving slowly toward the sea. 2,000 years of history gathered in one narrow place, and still moving forward. As you move now, slowly and gently, into the deeper reaches of sleep, we move forward into the long twilight. Chapter 13. The Fall of the Western Empire. Time period, 376–476 AD. Key figure, Romulus Augustulus and Odoacer. Major event, the fall of the Western Roman Empire. What ended? A civilization and the beginning of a new world. Everything that begins must end. The Roman Empire had lasted, in the West, for approximately 500 years from the reign of Augustus. Its ending was not dramatic in the way that endings in stories usually are. It was slow, complicated, debated. Historians still argue about when exactly it ended and why, but we can trace the shape of it. In 376 AD, something happened at the Danube frontier that the Romans had never seen before on this scale. An entire people arrived at the river. The Visigoths, a Germanic people who had lived along the northern shores of the Black Sea for generations, had been driven from their homeland by a new terror from the east, the Huns. The Huns were nomadic warriors from the Central Asian steppes, moving westward at speed. They were extraordinarily skilled horsemen, using a composite bow that could be fired from horseback at full gallop. They swept through the lands of the Black Sea region like a fire through dry grass. And ahead of them, the Visigoths fled. They came to the Danube, the Roman frontier, and begged to be allowed across. Into Roman territory, into safety. The Emperor Valens permitted them to cross. Hundreds of thousands of Visigoths crossed the river into Roman territory. It was the largest mass migration in Roman history to that point, and it was immediately mishandled. Roman officials exploited the refugees, demanding bribes, selling food at extortionate prices, reducing some to selling their children into slavery. The Visigoths rebelled. They had weapons and warriors and nothing to lose. In 378 AD at the Battle of Adrianople, the Visigothic cavalry destroyed the Roman army. The Emperor Valens was killed. His body was never found. Adrianople was the beginning of the end. Not because a battle had been lost. Rome had lost battles before, but because the settlement that followed established a new precedent. The Visigoths were settled within Roman territory as a federated people. They maintained their own leadership, their own laws, their own military structure. They were Romans in name, but they were not Roman in reality. They were a foreign people inside the borders, and they were there to stay. Over the following century, this pattern repeated. Groups of Germanic people crossed the frontier, some invited as soldiers and allies, some pushing through by force. Vandals and Sueves crossed the frozen Rhine in the winter of 406 AD. They spread across Gaul and into Spain and eventually to North Africa. The Vandals took Carthage, Rome's ancient enemy, in 439 AD. They controlled the Mediterranean grain supply. In 410 AD, the unthinkable happened. Rome itself was sacked. A Visigothic army under their leader Alaric captured and looted the Eternal City. For 3 days, the shock across the empire was profound. Jerome, a Christian scholar working in Bethlehem, wrote that he was struck dumb with amazement when he heard the news. The city that had conquered the world had been conquered. And then, in 476 AD, a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer, commander of the Roman army in Italy, deposed the last Western emperor. His name was Romulus Augustulus. Romulus, the name of Rome's legendary founder. Augustus, the name of its greatest emperor. History's sense of irony is sometimes very heavy. Romulus Augustulus was a teenager. He had been emperor for less than a year. He had been a puppet of his father, a Germanic general named Orestes. Odoacer killed Orestes and deposed the boy, but Odoacer did not kill Romulus Augustulus. He sent him into comfortable exile in a castle in southern Italy, where he apparently lived for years unharmed. The last Western emperor, living quietly, by the sea, Odoacer did not declare himself emperor. He sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople instead. He ruled Italy as a king under the nominal sovereignty of the Eastern emperor. The Western Empire simply stopped. Not with a battle, not with a declaration, just a boy emperor and a German general and an exchange of letters. And one empire becoming many kingdoms. And the world moving on. The sea outside the castle in southern Italy is very still tonight. The teenage former emperor looks out at it from his window. The stars are bright above the water. He is, in some ways, the luckiest man in the world. He is alive. In the centuries to come, very few deposed rulers would be so fortunate. He breathes the salt air. And so do you. Quietly now. Deeply. The empire has rested. As you rest. Chapter 14. What Rome Left Behind. The Eternal Legacy. Time period. 476 AD to the present. Key figure. The civilization itself. Major event. The transformation of Rome's legacy into the modern world. What survived? Almost everything that matters. Rome did not simply end in 476 AD. It transformed. Its language became the languages of half the world. Latin evolved, over centuries, into Italian and Spanish and French and Portuguese and Romanian. More than that, Latin remained the language of the church, of scholarship, of law, of medicine, and of science in the Western world for over 1,000 years after the empire fell. When Newton wrote his great mathematical and scientific works in the 17th century, he wrote them in Latin. When doctors diagnosed diseases in the 19th century, they used Latin terms. When biologists classify species today, they use a Latin naming system established in the 18th century. Latin is not dead. It is the quiet skeleton beneath the surface of almost everything in the Western world. Rome's law became the foundation of legal systems across Europe and, through European colonization, across the Americas, Africa, and much of Asia. The concept of innocent until proven guilty. The right to know the charges against you. The idea of contracts, of property rights, of inheritance law. These are Roman ideas, still functioning today. Rome's administrative structures were copied by every state that rose in its former territories. The medieval church organized itself geographically into dioceses, a Roman administrative term. Bishops held authority in their cities, just as Roman magistrates had. The Pope in Rome claimed a spiritual authority that mirrored the political authority the emperors had once held. The Catholic Church was, in many ways, Rome's most direct institutional successor. Rome's architecture never really went away. Every period of European history that considered itself educated and cultured returned to Roman models. The Renaissance looked to Rome. The architects of the 18th century looked to Rome. The designers of the American Republic looked to Rome so deliberately that the buildings of Washington, D.C. look like a Roman city. The Senate, the Capitol, the terms themselves are Latin. Senator is Latin. Capitol comes from the Capitoline Hill, one of the 7 hills of Rome. President comes from the Latin presidere, to sit before. The founding fathers of the United States were thinking about Rome when they built their republic, and warning themselves, consciously, against repeating Rome's mistakes, against allowing a Caesar to arise, against letting the republic become an empire. The road network, those 80,000 kilometers of straight paved roads, shaped the movement of people and goods and ideas for centuries after Rome fell. Many European cities exist where they do because a Roman road ran through that place. London, Paris, Vienna, Cologne, Strasbourg, Lyon, all of them Roman foundations. All of them cities because the roads brought people there. And because once people gather in a place, they tend to stay. Rome is still speaking. Every time you use a calendar, you are using the Julian calendar, reformed slightly by Pope Gregory XIII in 1582, but still essentially Julius Caesar's creation. Every time you speak of July, you are speaking the name of Julius Caesar. Every time you speak of August, you are speaking the name of Augustus. Every time you speak of romance, you are speaking of Rome itself. The language of love in Western culture comes from the language of empire. The eternal city. The Romans called it that themselves. Urbs aeterna. They meant it partly as propaganda. A city that would last forever. A civilization that would never end. They were wrong about the literal sense. The empire fell. The city was sacked and shrunken and changed. But something in the phrase was true. Not the city, but the idea. The idea of Rome. Of law and order and civic virtue, and shared identity and the capacity to build something that outlasts any individual life. That idea has never died. It lives in our legal systems, and our languages, and our buildings, and our political vocabulary. It lives in the way we think about what civilization means. It lives in the roads beneath our roads, and the languages beneath our languages, and the laws beneath our laws. Rome is eternal not because it lasted forever, but because what it built never entirely stopped. We have reached the end of our long journey tonight. From the 7 hills above the Tiber, from the she-wolf and the shepherd and the twin brothers and the slow brown river, through the Republic and its proud senators, through the Punic Wars and the genius of Hannibal and the stubborn courage of Rome, through Caesar and Augustus and the long golden centuries of the Pax Romana, through the emperors, the good and the terrible, through the roads and the aqueducts and the arenas, through the new faith that rose from a small province in the east and changed the world, through the crisis and the recovery and the moving of the capital, through the long, slow twilight of the Western Empire, and through the transformation of everything Rome had built into the world we still inhabit today. You have traveled very far tonight. Your body knows it. It is heavy now, deeply, completely heavy. Your legs and your arms and your hands. All of it resting, all of it warm, all of it safe. The ancient stones of Rome are very old and very patient. They have held the weight of 2,000 years without complaint. They can hold yours tonight too. Let them. The Tiber is moving in the darkness below the city. Slow and dark and ancient. It has been moving since before the city was built. It will be moving long after every stone of every building in Rome has finally rested in the earth. The river does not hurry. The river does not stop. It simply moves. Like your breath now. In and out. In and out. slow and steady and ancient. The forum is empty tonight. The marble gleams softly in the moonlight. The columns of the temples stand in their patient silence. The stones that saw Caesar and Augustus and Nero and Marcus Aurelius are still here, worn a little more by 20 centuries of rain and wind, but still here, still carrying the memory of everything that happened in this place. The road outside the city gates runs straight to the horizon. It always ran straight. The Romans believed in straight lines, in the shortest path between 2 points, in getting where you are going without unnecessary deviation. Tonight, the shortest path is the one you are already on, the path into sleep, the path into the deep, warm, ancient country of rest. You have walked the roads of Rome tonight. You have eaten at Roman tables and bathed in Roman baths and watched the races in the Circus Maximus. You have stood in the shadow of the Colosseum and watched the dome of the Pantheon open to the sky. You have heard the Latin phrases that are still alive in every language you know. You have carried a piece of Rome inside you your whole life without knowing it. You carry it still. Now rest with it. Let the weight of it be a comfort. You are part of a very long story. A story that began on 7 hills above a slow brown river. A story that has never entirely ended. A story that is still being told tonight. To you, in the warm dark, at the end of a long road, the eternal city sleeps. Its stones are warm from the long day's sun.